Hi there, and welcome to this CND webinar. We're just going to wait for everybody to join, and then we'll start shortly. So thanks very much to everybody for joining us for this webinar. My name's Sophie Bolt. I'm General Secretary of CND. I'm really delighted to have an excellent panel of speakers today for our session, which is around no US nukes in Britain. Don't make us a target. So we're obviously living in a time when the threat of nuclear weapons being used again in war has been growing, particularly around the war in Ukraine. And certainly the election of Donald Trump to the White House is creating greater instability and chaos, from the huge raft of economically damaging trade tariffs to the threat to ethnically cleanse the people of Gaza from their homeland. And today, US Defense Secretary Hegseth has unveiled for the first time the US's new framework for a negotiated settlement in Ukraine. I'm sure we will be discussing its implications, particularly the role that is being mapped out for European NATO member states, which must, as Hegseth argues, safeguard European security and provide the overwhelming share of future lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine. So it's in this context that we are discussing the risk that deadly US battlefield, as they're called, nuclear bombs, could now be deployed at NATO bases across Europe and Britain, and what this means for safeguarding such a European security. And of course, how we work to build genuine security for the populations of these NATO states, and of course beyond. So just in terms of how we'll run the discussion, we'll be taking our speakers. There's a Q&A function, so you can submit your questions there, and then we'll be asking the speakers to respond. So first of all, I'm going to introduce Ludo de Brabander from the Belgian peace movement. It's a real pleasure to have him with us. We've been working very closely with him for a number of years, and he plays an absolutely crucial role in terms of the opposition of NATO across Europe. So it's really great to have you with us, Ludo, and over to you.
Thank you, Sophie. So according to the head of the National Nuclear Security Agency, Jill Ruby, in her statement mid-January, as you know, the new B6112 bombs are fully forward deployed. That's what she said. And forward deployed, it refers to the tactical nuclear arms that have been deployed at different European military bases for several decades as part of NATO's nuclear sharing policy. And as in Britain, and it's the case in Belgium, I think also in Germany and other nuclear sharing countries, I come back to that, there was no confirmation by governments, and even the press, I couldn't find, in the Belgian press at least, couldn't find any attention to her statement, although these are weapons of mass destruction. So the B6112 is the latest version to replace all existing other types of the B61 bombs, and they are equipped with an electronic tail kit that can guide a bomb to the targets. And so they have lower yield options, and mixture of precision and lower yield are seen by war planners as more usable weapons. So in the context of the war in Ukraine, this is a very dangerous development. So in my contribution, I would like to focus on NATO's nuclear policy and the concept of nuclear sharing, because only gradually nuclear weapons became a central part of NATO's military post-Cold War strategy. Nuclear arms were considered a responsibility in the beginning of NATO's nuclear powers, and that changed at the NATO summit in Lisbon in 2010, so 15 years ago, when the alliance leadership accepted a strategic concept proclaiming for the first time to be a nuclear alliance. So in the reason why NATO became a nuclear alliance, that was because of the strong opposition that grew in the 80s, and also the strengthening of international humanitarian and anti-nuclear norms in the years after. So NATO was forced to adapt, which led to the collectivization of political responsibility of nuclear weapons. The political aim of emphasizing NATO's nuclear role was first that nuclearization of NATO as an organizational identity allowed pro-nuclear actors to justify costly nuclear modernization programs and nuclear deployments as contributions to alliance solidarity or alliance cohesion. Second, this nuclearization of NATO undercut the potential of inter-alliance resistance to nuclear arms, because calls for nuclear disarmament could be seen as anti-NATO. And this is something we witness, for example, in Belgium often, that this is a NATO obligation and we do not have to desolidarize with NATO. So nuclear sharing became a core component of NATO's strategy. Of the three nuclear powers in NATO, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States, only the United States has nuclear arms in other member states. And these are Belgium, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Turkey. Once there have also been nuclear arms, US nuclear arms in Canada until 1984, and Greece until 2001, and as you know, also in the UK until 1992. And according to many sources, the British government seems to have agreed again to deploy new US nuclear weapons, which is then in Lakenheath. So this is no news for you, I guess. Currently, the US has an estimated 100 tactical nuclear weapons deployed in Europe. There are no figures yet for the UK. But this is a number that is not officially confirmed, so it can be more. And they have to be mounted into, except for Turkey, dual-capable aircrafts in wartime. And each year, the nuclear sharing is exercised in what is called steadfast noon maneuvers that until a few years ago have been kept secret as well. And there are several legal and political problems with NATO's nuclear policies. First, the concept of nuclear sharing can be considered as a transfer of nuclear arms to non-nuclear states. The Non-Proliferation Treaty from 1970 prohibits the direct, or that went into force in 1970, prohibits the direct or indirect transfer, Article 1 and 2 of the NPT, or control of nuclear weapons to non-nuclear states. This would certainly be the case once the fighter jets of non-nuclear weapon states, like from Belgium, take to the skies and the permissive action links are activated that allow the nuclear weapon to be used during a military operation or on an all-open war. And so a Belgian pilot in that sense would be the one who activates, who drops the bomb. And this is, of course, then a nuclear activity from a nuclear state at that moment. A second problem is that there is no transparency whatsoever around the presence of US nuclear weapons at European military bases. It makes democratic debates, of course, and decision-makings virtually impossible, which is probably no coincidence. So if you don't admit nuclear weapons, you don't have to discuss about, and it creates no or cannot create public outrage. A third problem is NATO's aggressive stance toward the Nuclear Ban Treaty, the TPNW. NATO sees the TPNW as a threat to its political unity over the nuclear strategy. That's the reason for the strong dismissive language in the Vilnius Declaration, which was at the NATO summit in 2023. It was the summit in Vilnius, in Litauen, calling the TPNW in opposition or inconsistent and again also incompatible with the alliance nuclear deterrence policy. And at, and I quote, odds with the existing non-proliferation and disarmament architecture, causing, and that's according to NATO, risking undermining the NPT. In any case, the reactions and declarations of the US and NATO, these reactions are expressions of concerns about the general impact of the TPNW and the wide support it receives, endangering its political cohesion. Therefore, this Vilnius Declaration emphasizes that talks and negotiations on disarmament should be done with NATO as platform. In other words, NATO members are not supposed to initiate or participate in disarmament initiatives outside NATO or without the leadership of the US. The fourth problem with NATO's nuclear policy is that NATO has always been ambiguous in its nuclear policy. They play lip service to the NPT, but but while the nuclear powers of NATO continue to pour billions into replacing or upgrading their nuclear arsenals. By the way, the language NATO uses in the Vilnius Declaration is not such as to invite Russia or China to disarm. They blame these countries for the erosion of the disarmament regime while it remains silent over its own role in it, like the deployment of the missile shield after US pulled out of the ABM treaty, the US withdrawal of the INF, or the Open Skies Treaty, the Iran deal, and so forth. There are so many cases that NATO or NATO countries has a huge responsibility in what I can call almost proliferation and increasing nuclear danger in the world. So to finish, I think the challenge for the peace movement is to convince other social movements of the collective importance of nuclear disarmament. Like climate change, nuclear weapons are a planetary threat, and it's a challenge to convince these movements. I know it's not easy because nuclear weapons are not very high on the agenda, unfortunately. A wide social and political movement against the danger of nuclear war should be put forward a number of common demands. So first of all, we should ask full transparency must be provided on nuclear weapons in Europe to enable democratic debate at least and decision making. Secondly, we don't need any lip service to nuclear disarmament, but concrete disarmament initiatives leading to negotiations to avert the growing nuclear dangers in Europe. And this can only be successful if there is a ceasefire in Ukraine, international tensions are reduced, and mutual security interests are taken into account. 3, new agreements are needed. The withdrawal of nuclear weapons from the nuclear sharing countries can help shape conditions and commitments for a nuclear weapon-free zone in Europe as a kind of first step towards a nuclear weapon-free world. 4, a legal ban on nuclear weapons and accession to the TPNW. How difficult politically this seems to be, I believe there's always an opportunity to break this nuclear cohesion of NATO, as it was the case with the participation of several nuclear sharing countries. For example, Belgium, Germany, and Netherlands were at both meetings of state parties of the TPNW as an observer. This is at least a small breach in this cohesion. And 5, last but not least, we must, in my view, disband NATO as it's a war machine, in my opinion, militaristic machine, to achieve a nuclear-free world. To paraphrase NATO, as long as NATO exists, nuclear weapons will remain on the planet. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ludo. Very, very powerful speech. And then, I mean, just to say, in terms of this sort of like this increasing level of awareness around nuclear weapons, certainly we're finding in Britain that it really is increasing. And a recent sort of YouGov poll, it was around the kind of the doomsday clock and like people's concern about what's going to, you know, end the planet. And there's a big increase in terms of people feeling that it's going to be nuclear weapons that is the biggest sort of existential threat. It's up to 62%. So certainly we're in Britain, we're sort of seeing a greater kind of increase in that awareness, which is very important for us in terms of being able to kind of reach out and galvanize those people into action. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker now, which Jeremy Corbyn, who's been an MP for over 40 years now, and he is, I think, undoubtedly the national voice in Britain speaking out for peace and nuclear disarmament. And also, we're absolutely delighted here at CND that Jeremy is our vice president. One of our vice presidents. So it's an absolute pleasure to have Jeremy with us here tonight, speaking about why we are opposed to US nuclear weapons coming to Britain, and also in relation to the the disaster of our British government and its nuclear secrecy. So over to you, Jeremy.
Thanks, Sophie, and thank you very much for inviting me on. And what a pleasure it is to be on this call, and what a pleasure it is to be the MP for the CND office as well. And so I'm most grateful to you. We'd had a debate this afternoon here in Parliament in Westminster Hall, that's the secondary chamber, introduced by Brian Leishman, and it was about Britain's adherence to the International Court of Justice decisions concerning Palestine and the Middle East. And a lot of MPs came, it was well oversubscribed, and all made the point that if you wanted to be taken seriously on international law, and you couldn't preach the rest of the world about international law unless you abided by it yourself. And so we raised all the questions about arms supplies, arms sales, occupation, and trade with settlement goods and illegal settlements in the West Bank. And of course, the tragedy of more than 47,000 known deaths in Gaza. So that was the backdrop to the debate. Now, you might say, what's that got to do with the debate about nuclear weapons? Well, absolutely everything, because it is about how we adhere to international law and how we adhere to our obligations. This summer, there will be a preparation meeting for the NPT review conference. Indeed, the NPT review conference will take place in New York at the UN, and that will be reviewing progress or otherwise on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. At one level, you could argue, ever since it was introduced, it's had some successes. A number of countries have not developed nuclear weapons. A number of countries have given up nuclear weapons. There have been development of nuclear weapons-free zones in Latin America and Africa and Central Asia. But on the other side of it is that the declared nuclear weapon states have not taken the steps towards disarmament which they were required to do by signing the treaty in the first place. And all of them, contrary to that treaty, are both exporting nuclear know-how, and secondly, building a new generation of nuclear weapons at the most enormous cost. Britain is increasing defence expenditure to 2.5% of GDP, and there is a lot of pressure within the government, and indeed probably even more so in the Conservative Party, to increase it to 3% of GDP, and you hear the hawkish voices coming everywhere. Now that includes nuclear. And then when there was a debate, so-called, in the Labour Party about nuclear weapons some time ago, it never happened. The Prime Minister, the now Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, and the then Defence spokesperson, John Healey, now Defence Secretary, said two things. Well, one is that we are holding nuclear weapons and their presence is non-negotiable. And then secondly, there's no debate, no discussion, no change from that. This is absolutely set in stone. In other words, saying that Parliament has no say in the matter, members of the Labour Party have no say, nobody else does. And then complete silence on the question of the deployment of nuclear weapons to any bases in Britain. The suspicion is they're going to RAF Lakenheath, and we once more a deployment of nuclear weapons on British soil. We haven't been here for a very long time. Add that with the conflict in Ukraine. Now, possibly, and it is only a possibility, there's going to be some significant movement in the immediate future, which will bring about some kind of ceasefire in the conflict in Ukraine. For the sake of Russian, Ukrainian, and everybody else's lives, I obviously, like everybody in this call, hope that is the case. But this conflict has brought us perilously close to the nuclear option being considered by all parties to this conflict, and that is the danger of it. And so when Sophie said a few minutes ago that a lot of people in Britain now fear for their future and fear they may be annihilated by nuclear weapons, that is something new. Because there's a whole generation grown up who kind of unaware of nuclear weapons, unaware of the significance or the power of nuclear weapons, totally unaware of the cost of them, and have been fed a steady diet of messages from the arms industry that the arms industry is the greatest force for growth in Britain, provides jobs, high wages, and good conditions. Well, the wages are high, the conditions of work are not the worst, but what are they making and what are they doing? We've been producing a book through the Peace and Justice Project called The Monstrous Anger of the Guns, which challenges the power of the arms industry, its lobbying power, its power to influence foreign policy, and the effects of its weapons in different theatres of war, from Yemen to Congo, to Sudan, to Ukraine, and of course to what is happening in Gaza and the West Bank of Palestine. And so I think what we have to do is challenge a number of things. One, the whole morality of nuclear weapons. Can there be any circumstances on the 80th anniversary of the use of weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki that somebody would knowingly set off a nuclear weapon, knowing it would cause the deaths of hundreds, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, ignoring the effects of nuclear testing on the Pacific, on Central Asia, on the United States, and in so many other places? Is it really an irrational human being that could do that? One would like to think not, but the very presence of nuclear weapons, the deployment of them to this country amidst all this secrecy, is incredibly dangerous, not just to us, but to everybody else who may be affected by any kind of nuclear exchange. There will never be anybody who wins a nuclear war. It's impossible. A nuclear weapon is the ultimate weapon of mass destruction. You never know how many people are going to be killed as a result of it, what the effects will be on the environment that's immediately destroyed, what the effects will be on the world's climate through a nuclear winter that would follow, what the effect on the world's food supplies would be, the biodiversity, and everything else. A nuclear weapon can never be used in any kind of limited way. It is an unlimited weapon of mass destruction. That's why CND was founded in the first place. That's why CND has carried on so long. And that's why we have to demand support for the Global Ban Treaty, which the majority of the world's countries have signed up to. We have to oppose the development of a new generation of nuclear weapons, but we also have to have a comprehensive policy on preserving jobs doing something else. So we don't want people to be mass unemployment because of changes to the arms industry. We want investment in renewable energy, in renewable transport, in health and environmental causes. And all those things are quite possible. That's why in the project I'm involved with, the project Peace and Justice, which is obviously closely aligned to CND and Stop the War and many other peace organizations, we are actively promoting that kind of debate. Some might say, well, why are you doing this at a time when there's so much danger in the world? Why are you calling for peace at a time of war? That is precisely the time to call for peace. It's precisely the time to make that voice. And so I really do hope that there is going to be a cessation of the shooting and the violence and the bombing and the killing in Ukraine. And all those hundreds of thousands of people, Ukrainians and Russians, that have lost their lives will at least be recognized as people that have died in a war, but the war was finally stopped. I wished it had never started. I wished it had been, how should I put it, better handled by the world's institutions, by the United Nations, by the European Union, and so many others. It was left to the African Union and Latin American heads of state to make initiatives. Likewise, there has to be peace, there has to be justice for the Palestinian people. It won't be achieved while they're under occupation. And the presence of nuclear weapons in the Middle East is incredibly dangerous. And so those that are supporting and calling for a new nuclear arrangement with Iran, a non-nuclear weapons basis, whatever their nuclear industry is, should be supported and applauded. So we do bring about a nuclear-free zone ultimately in the Middle East. And so our work is far from done. In many ways, our work has to be re-beginning with a new sense of energy. And I want to compliment CND on doing this, compliment those that have demonstrated at Lakenheath and other places. But let's use the NPT conference in New York as a springboard for further action. And remember, this August we'll be remembering those that died at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those weapons, abominable and appalling as they were, that fried people to death, were mere fireworks compared to the power of the current weapons, the current warheads that are available. Let's go for a nuclear-free world. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jeremy. Always so powerful. And also thank you so much for everything that you're doing in Parliament in terms of, you know, raising these crucial issues, keeping the pressure up, and, you know, trying to sort of like get some answers from our governments. But yeah, so thank you so much. So we're now going to be hearing from Lesley Graham. Lesley's an amazing activist based in Norwich, and she's speaking here tonight on behalf of the Lakenheath Alliance for Peace, which is a coalition that's brought together over 40 organisations, which is all about putting the spotlight on Lakenheath and really encouraging like lots of protest and lots of sort of creative mobilisations. And it's already, you know, been doing a huge amount of work to do that. So it's really great to have Lesley with us here tonight. Over to you, Lesley.
Thank you very much. Everything that happens somewhere, and the worst things that happen are the ones that happen when nobody's looking. So we're looking, and we're bearing witness and being present as much as we can to shine some light on the horrors that are being planned and prepared in our names. We do not consent to our region or our representatives colluding or turning a blind eye. It's already not in our name, in the sense that there's never been any kind of democratic decision on the principle or practice of being a nuclear weapons state. The seat at the top table that nuclear weapons is supposed to give us is, of course, a seat for the elites of the military-industrial complex, not for any democratic mandate. And the new head of that top table is already showing himself to be rather worse than some of our nightmares. As Brits, we can't ultimately change the US regime, so there's all the more reason to defend our country from it. Half of the countries in the world have now joined the UN treaty banning nuclear weapons, representing 2.5 billion people. But sadly, the UK hasn't, and neither has any of the other nuclear weapon states. As East Anglians, we need to be NIMBYs, i.e. not in our backyard and not in anybody else's either. The closer you are to Lakenheath, the closer you are to a target for attacks, and also to the crimes being prepared in our names. Silence is compliance. It's also bloody dangerous for us as a sacrificial community. In recent years, US contempt for international law and its trashing of arms controls treaties have made the world far more dangerous. The threats to Gaza, Greenland, Panama, and even Canada are not the actions of a peace-loving leader. Central to US militarization and its increasing nuclearization is the extensive network of foreign military bases, about 800 in 80 countries. But we think that this is probably the biggest one in Europe. It's 27 miles near to Cambridge, 42 miles near Norwich, and 81 miles from the London Eye. Survivors from Hiroshima lead the Never Again movement, starting from where they are, to make the use of nuclear weapons illegal as well as taboo. And we target Lakenheath because that's the part of the war supply chain that's on our doorstep. And because as citizens of the world and of East Anglia, maybe it's our job to protect that nuclear taboo. With global corporate superpowered authoritarians emerging, it may again be local actions that see us through until their moment ends. It will be people like us who ensure, or at least improve the odds, that we still have a livable world left to reorganise. So how can we even start to do that? Well, in March last year, 12 people made a start and took a letter to the base for the commander and refused to leave until someone took it to him, which happened. Then we had a 10-day march and peace camp last July, and we actually got press coverage for most of those days. So hopefully a lot more people are aware of that now, and what Jeremy has said suggests they are. We have an ongoing presence with monthly vigils from 12 till 2 on the first Saturday of every month. So please come along if you happen to be in the region and can manage it. And we have big plans for this year, April in fact. We'll carry on the vigils, just to say we're not going away, but we're actually holding a 2-week peace camp there from the 14th to the 26th of April. So that's the week before and the week after Easter. There's going to be a 24/7 vigil at the main gate and an international peace conference on April the 24th, which is the day before Good Friday. The conference aims to analyse the political and military developments globally, regionally and locally, and draw together movements and activists from across the world to support each other, to strategise together, and to plan action for resistance and change. So please join us. There'll be something there for everyone. There'll be special days and workshops and talks. There's a Choirs Day for the 16th of April, a Green and Women's Day on the 17th. And on Good Friday, we'll be making the links between militarism and climate chaos. And it wouldn't be Easter Sunday without some Easter plane spotting, would it? On Monday the 21st, on Easter Monday, solidarity groups will gather to look at Lakenheath involvement in war crimes and military support enabling Israel to commit genocide in Gaza, among others. On Tuesday, it's Democracy Day, and we'll be inviting elected representatives to come, and we'll be doing workshops on how to get the best value out of your representatives at local and national level. There's a Faith Day, where there'll be events from different faiths, and then on Saturdays the big blockade, where we'll lock the main gates and stay there until everybody's gone. So how can you help? Well, you could come to a vigil at Lakenheath. As I said, they're on the last Saturday of every month, and the next one is February the 22nd, which is the same weekend as World Beyond War's Global Day of Action to close military bases. If you can only come for one day of the peace camp, please come and support the big blockade on the 26th, even if you don't want to take part in it, because the more people who are there, the safer it is for everyone. And do search online for Lakenheath Alliance for Peace and follow us on social media if you use it. The website has really useful information on the weapons and their launch systems at Lakenheath, the law as it applies to nuclear weapons, the many treaties that actually do make us more secure, and the activism that has helped to bring those treaties about. Look at the ongoing actions that you can be part of it, and then sign up to be part of it, so we know you're coming and we can send you important and relevant information. If you ask me questions where I need to look up the answers, the first place I'd go is to the website, and that also has links to lots of other useful sources, which includes CND, of course, and Scientists for Global Responsibility, and the Federation of American Scientists, who've told us some of what we know, because officially we don't know. It's also worth checking out Waging Nonviolence, which is an American activist network who do some amazing things in the face of phenomenal horrors. And also, of course, look at XR Peace and Just Stop Oil. Come to the base if you can and tell people about it. Tell everyone you know that the nuclear issue is live and that they can take a shared stand with you if they want to. If you're in an organisation, spread the word and see if your colleagues would like to add the organisation as an ally to the Lakenheath Alliance. Write to your elected representatives. Keep doing it or start doing it. Write to your local press, social media. That's really important to keep the issue on the agenda. And also, if you do get arrested, it's really useful to be able to say in your defence that you've tried everything else first. it's even more important in the sense of showing governments that peace is an electoral issue. City initiatives such as Mayors for Peace movement started from the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and have led to international law international lawmaking that's actually prohibited nuclear weapons and applies to an ever-growing number of countries in the world. It starts local. The little bit that you can do may feel like a drop in the ocean, but the ocean is made of drops. Thank you.
A brilliant way to end. Thank you so much, Lesley. That was really, really inspiring. And like, I really hope that people do exactly as Lesley has said and get up there to the peace camp and get involved. Certainly CND as part of the coalition is really turning around the peace camp and also particularly the international conference and the blockade, which will be really fantastic and inspiring. So do get along and check out CND's website for more details, or Lakenheath Alliance for Peace. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to our next speaker, which is Jess Barnard, who is the amazing activist and National Executive Committee member of the Labour Party, really fighting the good fight, and also a leading trade unionist. So we're really delighted to have her with us. She's been, you know, a real sort of leader around articulating those real sort of arguments for peace, for nuclear disarmament, and she's been really committed to protesting at Lakenheath as a Norfolk girl. So we're just really delighted to have Jess with us today. Over to you, Jess.
Thanks so much, Sophie, for that. Yeah, it was a lovely introduction. Proud Norfolk girl. It's great to see Lesley here as well. It's good to have two Norfolk representatives today. But thank you everyone for joining us, and obviously thank you to CND for organising what is a very timely and important event. Just thank you so much for having me. I think just to set the context, as other speakers have already, we need to recognise the role that we play in terms of the history of the British Empire and the current bombardments of countries around the world, and our role within that, from the bombardment of Yemen, selling arms to Saudi Arabia, the arming of Israel despite the very clear breaches of international law and the genocide that's taking place. We are up against a huge machine. It's the duty of every one of us to campaign against it. And the current Labour government, I'm ashamed to say, has continued to ally with regimes that flout international law and have persistently carried out those human rights abuses around the world. And, particularly Saudi Arabia, who continues to be the UK's #1 arms importer. But I think this is all despite the fact that Keir Starmer became leader of the Labour Party, committing to putting human rights at the heart of international politics, something which he has entirely turned his back on. And I just want to sort of, reflect on that, and I'll come on to this later on, but I think it's so important that we leverage our power as activists, whether you're Labour members or whether you're campaigners, to make sure that we uphold those commitments and we don't just let our politicians turn their backs on human rights. But just, I'm obviously now on Labour's NEC, but I was proud to have been the chair of Young Labour before, which was an organisation at the time that took up the kind of mantle of peace within Labour Party politics when it was so kind of desperately needed in sort of grand picture of the direction of travel in the party. And we were very clear then that our position, we were anti-imperialists, we were proud to stand in solidarity with international causes, and we understood that international solidarity and nuclear disarmament have to go hand in hand. And I think now more than ever that we've seen the unimaginable levels of destruction that we've seen in Gaza being experienced by millions of Palestinian civilians now. It's so important that we educate and we carry forward that political education about the need for nuclear disarmament. So just want to take a minute to thank everyone for their work, especially at CND, who are kind of leading that fight. And I think every day, at the moment especially, we are reminded of how fragile peace is and the dangers of a nuclear war. From Ukraine to Yemen, Sudan, Lebanon, Palestine, there is this constant reminder of the need for us to campaign, but also to respond and to ramp up our campaigning activity. So, something that Keir Starmer was right about was that he That's a very rare thing for me to say. But something he was right about was that the Labour Party has drastically changed under his leadership, and he has changed it back to a party that is very willing, very, very willing to fall in line behind the US. And I think that we have to be honest that that is what is shaping a significant amount of Labour's foreign policy at the moment. And I think particularly on foreign policy, you know, he is risking history repeating itself with this kind of Blairite strategy where he's showing the US that we will fall in line behind them and do whatever it is that they want. And now apparently we're willing to fall behind a madman who harbours fascists in his team, is going for all-out war on his own minorities in his own country. Very, very scary stuff. And I think we can be honest with ourselves that he's not going to give a crap about the lives of or the safety of people in Lakenheath. So we have to build the pressure on our representatives that they are accountable to us and not accountable to Donald Trump. And just to touch on that, you know, about the local level, people of Lakenheath, they don't want US nukes on their doorstep, right? The issues that people are caring about in this country, the things that are affecting everybody's day-to-day lives, people want good, secure, well-paying jobs that are going to be here for the future. They want their kids to be able to have that. They want affordable housing. They want people to know that, you know, you can have kids and they're not going to have to move out because they can't afford to stay in a local area and get a job and afford the rent. We need well-funded schools. People need good education, and particularly in places, you know, in and around Norfolk and Suffolk, people need to be able to see dentists and doctors, which for so long have been underfunded and suffered at the hands of Tory austerity. So these are all the things that we know local people are caring about, and yet, you know, there is this kind of no movement on those, and this determination that the only jobs that can be offered are apparently sort of surrounded around US nuclear weapons. And I think we have to fight back against that. But there are kind of, you know, things that we can take resolve from in the global picture, and lessons that we can learn from successful campaigns. And I do think, you know, although we haven't won every kind of everything we would want it to from this Labour government, we did see significant movements from the Labour leadership due to this mass movement that we saw in solidarity with Palestine because of that constant and determined and disciplined campaigning. I know CND are obviously part of the coalition that have been part of those London demonstrations, but also local organising has put the pressure on Keir Starmer to freeze those licenses on their weapons to Israel. So although there's much further to go and much more to build, I do think it's important we take heart and we take those lessons forwards when we're campaigning for nuclear disarmament. But also, I guess, on the international scale, like we know the global majority are united against war and destruction. We've seen the global majority united in one voice behind the Palestinian people. We've seen the leadership and the resolve of countries standing with Palestine and refusing to fall in line behind the US, the UK and Israel, but also challenging the war machines of the West who have for so long operated on like international policy through this kind of means of domination rather than collaboration. So I think, you know, it's clear that we are moving away from that era. So we're seeing this shift away from the US having, you know, hegemony over the kind of global stage. So, you know, while those things are shifting, I think it's quite dangerous for this Labour government to kind of be betting on this horse, so to speak. You know, we've talked at length, and I've talked at length before about the sovereignty of Britain and the dangers of surrendering that to the US. And I think we have to do, you know, keep making the case that no foreign power should be parking nuclear weapons in our lawns, and we won't accept it. And that's why those protests happening at Lakenheath are so important, as well, to show that won't just be accepted, and they won't be able just to sneak those in with no opposition. We've also heard a little bit today about the green transition and the ties between the arms industry and jobs kind of being seen as an absolute must, and this kind of economic growth at the expense of human lives. And I think we need to be honest that we need to see more from our trade unions driving the government towards a just transition. And nobody wants to see people kind of out of jobs and unemployed. That's absolutely not what's happening. But we need to be creating and pushing the government to create those green jobs for the future and that just transition that they committed to previously. But also tying in that, you know, this link with climate justice, which is of concern, should be of concern to every single one of us. But then there's also the element of compassion, right, and humanitarian politics. And it feels like this is a very unpopular thing to talk about at the moment when the far right are so on the rise, and we have a situation where the so-called left party are kind of in the same breath as like supporting Israel's total destruction of the homes of Palestinians, also opposing their right to take refuge here in the UK in the same way that Ukrainians are. It's this kind of race to the bottom politics, and that's why this kind of the work that we're doing here today and what we're talking about also ties in with the fight against the far right and towards a more compassionate and humanitarian government. So I guess I just want to touch on, before I finish, a little bit about how, like, what do we do about all this, and like, how do we influence the government? Because I guess I don't absolutely have all the answers here today, but you know, hopefully this could be the start of a conversation where we talk about what our tactics are and how we shift this Labour government, because they are so, at the moment especially, all consumed with outperforming the far right rather than taking leadership on the issue of war and weapons and human rights. So I think firstly, just taking a moment to reflect on the successes of that Palestine Solidarity campaign, winning those concessions, but obviously alongside that, never before really, especially in my lifetime, have the general public been so poised to understand the horrors and of weapons of war. You know, we've all just seen over the course of 14 months that the absolute horrific damage that does, and there are millions of people who are now aware of that and ready to be mobilized, right? We don't want to see mass destruction. We don't want to see Britain playing a role in the destabilization of other countries or destruction of their homes. So I think we can take heart in that there are many people very aware of these issues now who perhaps weren't engaged with it before. We can also kind of, you know, reflect on the coalition of voters that Labour kind of depends on, right? And it is a delicate situation for them at the moment. I think they are courting a lot of ex-Tory or potential reform voters, but they will need to retain that kind of delicate coalition of voters who are, you know, traditional Labour voters or potentially, you know, like ex-Green voters. These are people who care about a future for their kids, right? They don't want to see a steady decline into this sort of Trumpian political era. And so we have to make sure we appeal to them and say, you need to earn our votes. And, you know, what we can do in that process is, if you are like me, if you've decided you're going to stay in the Labour Party and you've come to the conclusion that I have, that you believe as a socialist the most influence you can have is to operate inside the party as a Labour member, then use that membership. You know, don't just be silent, don't just attend CLPs, but, you know, move motions, debate people, confront the issue. And, you know, if you have Labour MPs, it's about lobbying that MPs. You know, you have access as a Labour member more so than the average person. So challenge them on this. And the worst they can do, right, is ignore us. But the closer we get to the next election, the more likely we are to see MPs rebelling, because their seat in Parliament depends on the people, not on Keir Starmer personally. And I guess the other thing as well is to join your trade unions. Like, if you aren't already, I'm sure many people on this call are already members of trade unions, but this is a place where we have to be having these conversations much more, and passing motions at branches is one way to do that. But hosting those conversations on how trade unions can leverage their power inside the Labour Party is absolutely key, because the trade unions have so much power in the Labour Party. They have access to many of the decision-making bodies, where it's the MPF, the NEC. And I think that, you know, if we're being honest, if each of the major trade unions in the Labour Party took it upon themselves to sort of spearhead the transformative policies that we need to see, we would see a completely different Labour Party. And the power is in their hands. It's just about making sure that the trade unions are reflecting what the members, the lay members want to be happening. So please, stay active and involved in your trade unions. And then obviously, finally, join the protests at Lakenheath, get out on the ground, because I guess there's nothing more it's healthy, isn't it, to get out and get out on the campaign, but also, you know, to be part of a community that all feel the same. Otherwise we kind of fall into these isolated groups, and it can feel a bit miserable. And sometimes people talk to me and they say, God, it's miserable hearing NEC report backs from you, Jess. But you know, I think this is one way to make sure that we keep up the fight, we stay around people who are like-minded, also part of the campaign, also passionate, share our lessons and share our energy. But I will be joining in April, and I hope to see many of you there with me. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jess. As always, like so inspiring and like really helping to give us like lots of energy. Before I come to our final speaker, I just wanted to flag up. So Sarah Lazenby says, I want to praise Jess Barnard for all she does in a party that needs her very much. That is so true. So just want to pass it on to you now. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to our final speaker. Tom Unterrainer is the chair of Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. So great to have you with us, Tom. And over to you for the sort of the final rousing speech.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you to all of the other speakers. Now, whether you're a member of any political party or not, I'm going to ask you now, if you're not already a member of CND, to join, and I'll close in the same way. And you need to join and you need to get active, because we live in incredibly dangerous times. And you don't just need to take my word for it, you just need to look at the determination of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists and the fact that they have moved the hands of their doomsday clock, this measure of how close humanity as a whole is to stark existential risks. They've moved it even closer to midnight. Doomsday is at hand, but for all too many people, as we know, doomsday has already arrived, because we live in an era of war, we live in an era of genocide, and we live in an era of global shifts where the response of the main governments, the most powerful military governments on the planet, is to pour fuel on the fire. And one example of that, just one example of that, is the fact that the United States is intent on increasing its nuclear bootprint, of increasing the presence of nuclear weapons across the planet, and that includes at Lakenheath. So where to begin with this particular situation at Lakenheath, one which seems incredible, extraordinary even, but which is in fact none of these things. None of these things, because when it comes to questions related to nuclear weapons, UK foreign policy, US foreign policy, the nuclear armed alliance, NATO, and the rest, the incredible, the extraordinary, and the downright grotesque are in fact entirely normal. What passes for normal in the military and the government is, however, potentially deadly. So as we know, there are numerous indications to suggest that the United States intends to deploy a new range of nuclear bombs at the Lakenheath airbase. This prospect has been public for some time now, following details contained in the US defense budget. It could even be the case that new US bombs have already been deployed. That could be the case. Numerous questions have been asked of successive governments seeking clarity on what exactly is planned. Successive British governments have declined to offer any clarity whatsoever. Some variation of, and I quote, the government is unable to comment on US spending decisions and capabilities, which are a matter for the US government, is the best that is usually offered. Now, what a relief it must be. What a relief it must be for democratically elected representatives in the highest ministries of the land to be able to dodge questions simply because the government is, and I quote, unable to comment. Now, since the formation of the British Parliament in 1707, it's been clear that parliamentarians are frequently unable to do a great many things, but offering comment isn't usually one of them. So why this omerta, to use a mafia term, when it comes to US nuclear weapons? Why indeed? British politicians are usually very happy to talk about nuclear weapons in general. The present government pledges an unshakable commitment to them and to the nuclear-armed NATO alliance. When asked, a majority of would-be prime ministers and sitting prime ministers pledged themselves ready, willing even, to use nuclear weapons. When asked, a majority of them refused to engage in serious and honest discussion about what that use would amount to, but that doesn't stop them from waffling on. And of course, there is much talk, incessant talk, of Britain's independent nuclear capabilities. Speaking of which, quite a bit of such talk was to be found on social media over the last week or so. I noticed somebody asked why CND is still on X. Well, this might be one of the reasons. If any of you over the past few days have taken the time to search the terms US, UK, Trident on a certain platform, you'd have found a reasonably large number of Americans pointing out the various ways in which Britain's allegedly independent nuclear deterrent is not so independent at all. And thanks to the work of the late John Ainslie, particularly his chapter on nuclear dependency from his Future of the British Bomb, we are reminded that the missiles are leased from the United States, something the government actually admits. But we're also informed in detail, in great detail, of a whole other host of dependencies. Now, the thing about the Americans posting about this is that, by and large, the posters aren't committed nuclear disarmers. They're not critics of current US foreign policy. They're not peace campaigners, etc. No. They seem to be very, very enthusiastic supporters of Donald Trump. And their purpose in pointing out the not-so-independence of Britain's nuclear capabilities had nothing to do with anti-nuclearism and everything to do with indicating that the British government should toe the line, or else what? Well, tariffs, of course, and striding in lockstep with the Trump administration's priorities. Now, the actual story of Britain's dependence on the US for nuclear and defence is rather more complex and nuanced than the version paraded on social media. It's not simply the case that the US is doing Britain a little favour. The US gets something too. Actually, they get rather a lot, including a convenient for them nuclear base in Scotland, access to intelligence and data gathering infrastructure, and a whole host of air bases and other facilities spread across the country. All of these facilities are conveniently located at striking distance to geopolitically important parts of the world. And of course, one such facility is the Lakenheath Air Base. Now, the British government can't really comment on developments at Lakenheath because, despite going under the name of RAF Lakenheath, it's actually a US Air Force base. There's a picture of it behind me here. The British government can't really publicly ponder, question, or criticise developments at this base or elsewhere because, as the MAGA, as their known commentators, know as well as we do, British capabilities are dependent upon the US. Now, when I refer to the British government, I should really say British governments to date, because a British government that had left NATO, scrapped nuclear weapons, and severed military cooperation with the US, that is, a government that pursued an independent foreign policy and pursued a policy of common security, would be able to do all of these things. They would. The fact that we have no such government, and the fact that Mr. Trump looks set to continue Mr. Biden's policies, as Mr. Biden continued Mr. Trump's policies, makes our action and our determination to sound the alarm all the more important. Why? Because developments at Lakenheath and other UK bases are not isolated. As we heard from Ludo, they're part of a pattern of similar developments across Europe. They're part of a pattern of military escalation across Europe. And this escalation ranges from an expanded NATO blueprint to the deployment of new B-6112 bombs, to plans to station hypersonic missiles in Germany, plans and developments that were underway well before Russia used its own hypersonic missile. Further, talks of new missile defense systems to complement the Aegis Ashore systems already stationed in Poland and Romania will undoubtedly lead to reciprocal developments. Then we have the prospect of significantly increased NATO troop deployments in Eastern Europe. And the prospect floated more than once, most recently when the British Prime Minister visited Kiev, of a NATO military presence inside Ukraine. And many of you here will have seen on the news the statements from Hegseth, the new US Defense Secretary, about exactly what the US intends for European so-called security in the coming months. If all of these prospects weren't troubling enough, and they were all in train prior to Trump's re-election, we have Donald Trump himself to consider. We'll remember the apparent disruption caused to NATO during the first Trump presidency. The fact of the matter is that NATO states have largely now complied with Trump's demands those years ago. Europe is remilitarizing, and military spending is at positively Trumpian levels. And it looks almost certain that the new Trump administration will force the issue even further this time around. So let's be absolutely clear, notwithstanding everything that Hegseth has said about troop numbers and the US's other political priorities, Trump is highly unlikely to withdraw US nuclear weapons from Europe. He's highly unlikely to withdraw new US military technologies from Europe and material from European NATO member states. In fact, it's almost like certain that all of these things, apart from overall US troop numbers, all of these things will see significant boosts. What we're likely to see are demands for ever increased military spending by NATO member states, an ever increasing demand for deployment, and ever increasing consent and compliance with US priorities. Now, any settlement of the high casualty, highly destructive, and inexcusable war in Ukraine is unlikely to bring stability and enduring peace if it's accompanied by a hyper-militarization of Europe as a whole. And that's the direction of travel that Hegseth and others have set today. The only way to ensure enduring peace is as follows: to kick the nuclear weapons out, to disband the nuclear-armed NATO alliance, and to pursue policies that recognize that security for one state can never be at the expense of another state. If you want to be part of making that happen, you need to join the peace movement, you need to join CND, you need to get involved, because we are quite literally facing the fight of our lives. Join CND. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Tom. Really excellent final speech there. So we're now going to go on to some questions. We've had a number of questions in the chat, so thank you very much to everybody who submitted theirs. I think what I'll do is, because of the time, I will kind of read out, you know, a number of questions, and then I'm going to hand it over to our speakers, and you can decide, you know, which ones you want to respond to. Yeah. So I'm going to take a few. So we've got sort of a question sort of statement kind of coming in from Tom Cuthbert, saying that, you know, these B-6112 bombs, you know, are bad enough, but also there's a whole danger around the fighter jets that will launch these bombs, the F-35A fighter jets, which are incredibly dangerous. So, you know, lots of crashes. So, you know, so it'd be good if people can kind of talk about the, you know, the risks of countries like hosting US nuclear weapons and nuclear systems. So that question. We've also had Andrew Lohman was saying, you know, he's a retired electronics engineer, sort of tried as much as possible to avoid the arms industry, but you know, sort of talking about how like the arms companies are still like getting like, you know, these huge contracts and not actually kind of completing the work. So this kind of, you know, complete unaccountability of the arms industry. So it'd be good if like people can kind of talk about, you know, how we can be sort of challenging the militarization of our economy. We know that that's definitely something that the British government is really pushing. So that's on that. And then Tony has made a really good point around the importance of sort of peace education and also, you know, peace activists, that the movement having a presence and organising with within universities, but also sort of peace education within schools. And again, I think, you know, we all know that the increased kind of militarization of our societies is seeing sort of an increase in terms of like the army, like, you know, trying to get into careers fairs, and there's a huge pushback within universities on that. But also, you know, we have like BAE systems going into schools, you know, up in Barrow and places like that. So yeah, to sort of really kind of take up that. And then I think the final thing really is kind of how can we sort of like, you know, raise awareness about what's going on at Lakenheath. How can we get it into the papers? How can we increase you know, sort of global solidarity? You know, how can we kind of increase those links across, you know, in the US? So those are a number of questions for you to kind of ponder over and respond to. Just while you are, I just wanted to kind of quickly say a little bit about how CND has been responding, you know, most immediately to the sort of the news about the potential sort of deployment of the nuclear weapons coming to Lakenheath. So, you know, we've written to Keir Starmer and to John Healey, basically kind of calling on them to kind of come clean about what's going on, saying, you know, you can't hide behind this kind of, we can neither confirm nor deny, you know, stuff. It's just completely outrageous. You know, there's huge risks for people if we are going to be hosting these nuclear bombs, because, you know, it makes us a target. Not surprisingly, we're still waiting for that reply. But also to keep the pressure up, we've launched a legal challenge against the Ministry of Defence as well as Suffolk County Council over what looks like its failure to include an emergency plan for any kind of nuclear accident or incident involving these new B6112 bombs at Lakenheath. We just think it's, you know, it's absolutely shocking that not only will the government, you know, not say anything about what's going on, so they're not accountable, but also it doesn't appear to be any safety plans in place. So really, really shocking. And this Friday, we've got supporters have already been kind of like lobbying their MPs. We've got kind of like a model email that people have been sending around this. And we've got supporters are going to be lobbying their MPs' constituency office this Friday to really, as I say, like keep the pressure up and get these MPs to be speaking out about Lakenheath. So I just wanted to feed that into you. And obviously, of course, we are all really really sort of pushing to make sure that we get a really good turnout for the peace camp and the blockade that's coming up on the 26th of April, Saturday the 26th of April. So that's just to update you on that. Okay, I'm now gonna like hand back to our speakers who can decide which ones you want to respond to. So if I go kind of I'll take Lesley, and then I'll take Ludo, and then I'll take Tom.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that you're going for the council on lack of nuclear preparedness. I think, you know, councils have a duty of care, and it's their job to do emergency planning and to have a register of risks. We've tried raising the nuclear risk within local councils, and they'll give you all sorts of excuses for why it's somebody else's problem. And they'll get really, really annoyed. And if you make your inquiries and don't get anywhere, and then make them more public, so maybe put in an open letter to the press so that everybody knows that you care about this. It tells your local representatives that their voters care about it. And it tells, and it just makes it better known that a nuclear accident isn't really something you could prepare for. That was the Red Cross said this, was it maybe 10, 15 years ago? And there was a bit of an outcry, and then it went quiet. So well done CND for bringing it back again. And one other thing I want to answer is about the lack of independence of the RAF. So when I was in court, a long time ago for going into Lakenheath, I was shown sight of a document which was a fact from the Pentagon authorizing the RAF to disclose the fact that the cluster bombs we were protesting about were actually there. And it wasn't at all surprising that the cluster bombs were there, but the fact that they had to get authorization from the Pentagon to disclose that fact actually felt really shocking at the time.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Lesley. Okay, over to you now, Ludo.
Yeah, maybe a few words about the F-35. Of course, there is, I think last year there was a report by the guy who was responsible for, you know, the operational part and so of the F-35, and it has been partly kept secret, but apparently there have been a lot of defenses, how you call it, a lot of problems with the F-35, as we know, and they were already in the press in the years before. So it seems to be confirmed, although they continue the production, nevertheless. There's a lot of money going on and interest, I think, by Lockheed Martin. So they have not only this, but they have also a problem of fuel consumption that is much higher than, for example, the F-16s, 5,200 liters for one flight hour. That's a lot of, so it's also a climate problem, these F-35s. But of course, if these, in most countries, my country, for example, the former government, they decided to buy 34 of these F-35s. And they have three tasks: military intervention, so also protection of the airspace. But the third one, which is not openly discussed, is of course the nuclear sharing policy. So the tasks of, and this is of course something dangerous. If these planes are not well functioning and they have to use these nuclear bombs, we never know in what. Usually they work with dummies, but yeah, one day maybe they will use them also in the real bombs, and then of course it's very dangerous if these planes are not trustworthy. So this is, yeah, but of course it's connected to it, and I think most countries, only Germany is, even Germany bought now or decided to buy F-35. So most countries uses these F-35s because they are connected to the B6112. It's the same company that is involved, Lockheed Martin. Also a word about peace education. Just, I think what we see is a very, a very dangerous militarization of society, and it's also going into education. And to give you an example, we just have a new government in Belgium. It's a right-wing one. You see it also in the program. Tomorrow we have big demonstrations and strike in the whole of Belgium. But also on the military side. And so one of the plans of this government is to have military people or people connected to the military to explain in the schools why defense is important and why we need a defense. And so they really see it as strategic communication to make people ready and to convince them that they need to spend more, that we need to arm more and so forth, because of the danger of Russia. And other dangers probably, and so that we need this military spending of at least 2%, which will probably be 3.5% after June when the NATO summit is going on. And the last thing, maybe a word about the NATO confirm or deny policy. You mentioned also, Sophie. It's of course the same answer. It makes if you ask as a parliamentarian in Belgium, they will say we neither confirm or can deny the presence of nuclear arms on Belgian soil. And this is since 61. I don't know. Nobody knows really when these nuclear weapons were deployed, but it's already going on like for more than 60 years. This policy of neither confirm, neither deny. And all the time we insist to have more information in it. One of the arguments we use is we had legal actions, but we didn't succeed. It's very difficult if they not confirm their presence. But what you say, of course, is very important. As with nuclear power plants is the case, we have no knowledge about safety plans, for the people around the military base. So if there is an accident with one of these arms, we don't know even if there is any safety measures and so plan or whatever. So this could also be used in a legal action, which is what we consider, we have to show interest. And so to find people that live around these bases and say, I don't feel safe, I want to know it, I want to know if there is a safety plan. And so that's why the government should say at least that these bombs are there or not. So just to give this remark on what you said. Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ludo. Really, really helpful. Okay. So finally over to you then, Tom.
Thank you, Sophie, and thanks to everybody else, and thanks for the questions. To come to Tom Cuthbert's point and his question about the potential dangers, whether or not there are nuclear bombs stationed of the new series of fighter jets. Well, yes, of course, there are dangers. Every new bit of highly sophisticated technological equipment which is deployed for the purposes of war fighting and for making war, they are highly complex, highly developed, highly technological devices. And the question that you have to ask yourself, and which I always ask myself, is this: how many things, at what time, and in what order need to go wrong for these machines of death, for these dangerous, destructive devices to pose a risk to us all? And we heard from Ludo and from others that there are safety concerns surrounding the new F-35s, but it is not limited to these particular devices. I'm currently living just a few miles away from Land's End, out on the edge of nowhere. And you'd think that in this remote part of the world, in this remote section of the United Kingdom, I won't call it England because Cornwall is clearly not in England, you'd think there are no risks, no dangers here, no problems at all posing themselves. We'd all be pretty safe out on the edge. Well, just like everybody else who lives on these islands, this highly militarized island, this site of extensive military operations, both UK and US, just like everywhere else in this country, no matter where you are, out on the edge here, just a few miles from Land's End, there are dangers ever present. Just up the road, there's a GCHQ monitoring station. A few miles away, there's RAF Portruth with a radar station. A bit further along, there's a naval base where they test and develop drones. A bit further up into Cornwall, there's GCHQ Bude, which is a major US-dominated, it has to be said, monitoring station, just like Lakenheath, which has become even more of a target with the prospect of US nuclear deployment, and the reality, as we know, of F-35 deployment there. Just like that has become a more intense target as a result of these developments, there are targets dotted around the country. And I think part of our job in explaining exactly how intense and how expansive the links between the UK and US military are, we need to explain what is at risk here, rather than making any of us safer, which is what all of these installations, technologies, and weaponry are supposed to do. That's what our government tells us they do. Rather than making us safer, they make us a target. They make us more insecure. It is not about ensuring security. It's not about defense. They're pouring fuel on the fire. The question about challenging militarism in the economy, it's a major driver of what, in terms of what the government is saying, in terms of the growth agenda. Well, short-term, precariously, perhaps, but what has become clear in particular around Britain's continued propping up and arming and support of Israel's genocide on the people of Palestine is that these machines of death, can be put to the use for which they were designed. And a huge number of people are fully aware of the extent to which British technology, British manufactured weaponry is being used to kill people in Palestine, is being used to maim, is being used to carry out a genocide on the people of Palestine. And that's why you've seen a whole series of protests, demonstrations, and actions around military manufacturing sites in this country. It's true, it is true, but it's a different level of question that the movement as a whole needs to find answers and needs to propose solutions in terms of moving to a socially useful level of production. We're not saying to people you should be out of a job on the scrap heap, yada 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 yada, instantly. But what we are saying is that there is a real present day consequence to the work that is being done, to the things that are being manufactured, and we can see it on social media, we can see it on our television screens, and the consequence is dead bodies. When it comes to the massive ramping up of military production, which is intended for this country, the piles of corpses will be even higher. And what we need to do is intensify our efforts to explain exactly what the consequences of all of this production for war and genocide actually means. There are other points that have been made, including one from Linda about, how do we raise awareness of this in the United States? I think it'd be very good for CND to be able to discuss with people based in the US. How do we raise the funds? How do we raise the money to get Sophie and others across the United States for a speaking tour, for instance, to explain to the movements there and to communities there exactly what is going on at Lakenheath, the United Kingdom, and across Europe. And just to finish on this point, there's a question or a point posted by Gilbert around the question of a nuclear winter. And, it has been the case that, it can be quite difficult to discuss or to raise the ultimate consequences of nuclear use in general public and in general discussion, because there is this idea, nuclear weapons and the prospect of nuclear war and nuclear use as a result of the attitude of our politicians and our governments has become normalized grotesquely to a certain extent. But it's true what Gilbert says, and it's true what Jeremy said earlier. And these are not one-use, limited-use weapons. One single use is the end of us all, and that's what nuclear winter means. That's what the prospect of omnicide means, and linking that directly to the determinations made by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists and their doomsday clock, the fact that we are so close. The nuclear risk combined with the reality of climate catastrophe, the introduction of new technologies, and everything else poses really stark, really sharply posed dangers for us all, which is why, if you're not a member of CND, you should join and help us to promote all of this and to help us in our campaigning work and to help us to avert the very worst that is on offer from the current form of government we have, the military alliances they maintain, and the sort of social, economic, and political system we endure at the moment. So join CND.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tom. And thank you very much for all of our speakers and to everybody here who's contributed through your questions and participating in this webinar. As people have said, it's, we know it's a very serious time, but also more and more people are becoming aware of the real threat of nuclear weapons and want to do something about it. And we can help those people to get more involved. I've put in the chat a link to CND's page about campaigning against US nuclear weapons in Britain. It includes a model email for you to send to your MPs. We'd really encourage you to do that. If you can get to your MP's constituency office on Friday when they're there, please do that as well. This is all about really putting the pressure on this government to come clean on what's happening at Lakenheath, because we all know how serious the risks are. not just in terms of local communities, but also globally in terms of, you know, as Tom was sort of saying, what these weapons can do. But ultimately it is always public protest, it's public pressure that has, you know, has stopped this sort of the nuclear taboo, you know, has stopped nuclear weapons from being used again in war. And so we have to kind of keep up that pressure to make sure that you know, that continues to be the case. So thanks very much again. Keep up all your amazing work, and looking forward to seeing you at RAF Lakenheath in April. All right then, take care. Bye.